is glyphosate, making my children autistic, and is it killing the bees, and is it giving us cancer, and all these things? Is the answer I don't know, or is there a succinct, here's what people misunderstand about Monsanto?
And a woman all the way at the back of the lecture hall, all the way up, raises her arms straight up, and I'm like, yes, you there. She goes, I don't believe a word out of your mouth. One morning I woke up and people are cheering and clapping. You can hear the whole village lighting up, And it turns out that they had decided that it was two guys in a town over that had been released from prison that were causing these robberies. So they went to their homes with literal machetes and torches and demanded they send those two guys out. They drugged them back to the center of town. They put tires over them. They poured kerosene on them and they lit them on fire. And there was this little old lady that I would see every single day. We'd sit next to each other. I started talking with her, and it turns out she worked 3 jobs. Her life was incredibly difficult. Her children were in and out of drug rehab, and she was working incredibly hard. And the whole time she was sitting there saying, I know it's hard now, but Jesus is going to repay me in the end in heaven. And I was like, this is a trick that you were having played on you. Now as a 42-year-old, I can understand maybe that's the story that she needed to tell herself to make the right kind of sacrifices to make this thing all work. One of the big insidious things that goes on with inflation is that as the government prints more money.
All right, this episode of the Noble Lore podcast is brought to you by Noble Lore, my business. What does my business do? Well, we produce podcasts, and so maybe you decide, hey, I like dentistry, and I want to talk about dentistry to the world, but I don't know how to get my message out to people. You come to me and say, Jack, what do? I say, you show up and talk, I will take care of the rest, which includes the editing, the production, the distribution, everything that goes into it, the marketing. I take care of it all so that you just sit back and don't have to deal with the overwhelm of starting a podcast. Now, before we start this episode, it would mean the world to me if you would subscribe so we can start growing our numbers, get that count up. And then if at the end of this video you decided, hey, this was a video that I liked, please do that. Please give it a like. I think you'll find some very interesting insights into this episode. It is with Vance Crowe. Vance currently owns a business called Legacy Interviews, which captures stories of the older generation and passes down their wisdom onto their families via video. And essentially what this is doing is capturing your loved ones as they are, and so that you can remember them as they were. I hope that you enjoy my interview with Vance Crowe of the Vance Crowe podcast and owner of Legacy Interviews. Vance, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So you mentioned to me just before this that you challenged me not to try to get your life story down, but let's get the main background of who is Vance Crowe.
Well, I always start with I was the middle child of 7 that grew up in small town central Illinois, and that all I wanted to do was leave small town America to go see the world. And so I went off to college and I had no idea what I wanted to study. So I studied communications, and I ended up getting an internship at a PR firm, because when you study communications, you have to find some kind of a job. And I got there and I was like, wait, what in the hell are we going to spend our time doing? I have literally no interest in doing this. I don't want to prop people up. I don't want to try and get them in the newspaper or change stories. This is propaganda. And so I was totally disillusioned and decided, all right, I'm going to go do something radically different. And I became a deckhand on a ship. And then my life just went in kind of weird directions after that.
Do you think that you're unique to other men your age right now?
Every man is on a journey, and every man has this internal, what am I doing with this time? Am I doing okay? Am I doing enough? You have this emotional barometer about am I succeeding or am I failing? And so in that, no. And in fact, as I've gotten older, I've started to realize I'm not unique in that every single man has struggles. And so that makes us kind of one.
Is it fair to characterize yourself as unique in the actions that you take? For instance, you're extremely, extremely intentional about how you're raising your children. And I feel like you are doing that because you have seen this wave of almost parents tapping out to some degree or resigning to a little bit and letting the government or all of these different factors control their lives. Is that somewhere in the ballpark of fair to say?
the thing that springs to mind is the other day was teaching a class on communication, and part of the class was on conversation, and I was trying to get people in the group to talk. I needed one side to just talk for 2.5 minutes, and the other side was going to react only using body language. And so I thought, well, how can you get somebody to have a 2.5 minute story if they're not really a storyteller? And I was like, well, the obvious thing to do here is just say, all right, tell us everything that happened from when you woke up to when you showed up in this room, but include the internal dialogue that you have. So like, I woke up, oh, it's cold outside. I don't want to get out of bed. Oh, I better get out of bed. And, oh, now I need to go to the bathroom. Oh, I'm running late, right? This internal monologue that I have in my mind. And what I found was out of the 6 people in the course, 2 of them were like, excuse me, I don't have an internal monologue, right? Like or at least it doesn't get recorded in this way. And so they're like, I don't know what you want me to say. I didn't have anything to say. And it was really awkward for them because they were like, and I had heard that 10% of the population doesn't have an internal monologue, but I guess I hadn't really internalized it until yesterday that this is, what an existence would be like in that. Because for me, my internal monologue dialogue is going on at all times. I am talking to myself. There is a voice inside of me that I don't control that likes me, doesn't like me, tells me to protect myself, tells me I'm being weak, tells me I'm great, has all of these things to say. And in that, that's where the uniqueness lies. It's like that I am the only person that can hear this voice. And that voice drives me to be unhappy at certain things. And so I leave them, or to think like, this is exactly what I have to do. And I'm discovering that not everybody has that kind of internal monologue. So in as much as I am unique, it is unique that whatever that voice is.
Would you characterize that voice as Vance Part 2? Would you characterize it as God? What would be your closest guess to that?
So the voice that I'm talking about is like been well explored. So Goethe talks about the daemon, and this is like this internal thing. And for a long time, I went around being like, hey, you have a daemon inside your head, and I'm going to try and get it to wake up. And our shared friend, Benjamin Anderson, one time pointed out a Jungian quote about like, hey, what are you doing waking people up to their inner voice? Like there's no like benefit to you. It doesn't matter if other people hear that voice. It doesn't. And so, yeah, like I think that I am describing something that is many people have. And I don't know if it's God, or I don't know if it's just the consciousness that we needed to have in order to evolve as humans. But I have it, and I sense when I talk about it with other people, many other people have it, but not everybody does. So it's hard for me to say it's God.
Okay, but Benjamin went to you and said, what are you doing?
No, we were both like super into this idea.
Oh, gotcha,
like, right?
gotcha,
We were
gotcha.
both like,
You want to be
yeah,
doing
like
this.
we're like 2 primates being like, I have a voice inside
Gotcha.
my head, and then he's like, ooh, I have a voice inside of my head, and then we're like talking about this, and then he goes off and finds Jung and starts, reading his stuff, and then one day comes back and he's like, dude, I found this passage from Jung, and he says right here, don't wake people up to this. Like, it's not your responsibility to try and point out whether they have it or not.
That's very interesting, because the Parium group that I've mentioned several times that of Benjamin, our mutual friend Colton Smith, we came together and created this, but a recurring theme is like, how do we give people agency over themselves? So a quote that Benjamin likes a lot is the most powerful thing to do is to give power away to others. Is that not giving power away to other people?
Maybe. I don't know. The internal voice that I have, I originally thought this is the all good voice. This is the voice that tells me where I should be going. And now, a few years after having that original position, I've come to the conclusion that like, no, like I don't know where the genesis of this voice is. I don't know that I think that it is good. I don't know that I think that it's probably something core to me, and it's like a driving factor within me, but I don't know whether it's good or bad. I don't know if God or the devil or maybe multiple versions of that, or if it's just some genetic artifact that's left over. And so whether or not that somebody else hearing that voice is what tells them to have agency, I don't know. Because as we talked about at the beginning of this, there are some people that they just don't have an inner monologue. So I can't say that those people can't have agency. In fact, I look at a lot of those people and think, you have a way higher amount of agency than I do. And because you seem to be much more in control of get up, do this thing, they don't have to like wrestle with this person to start lifting weights in the morning or to go for a jog or to like eat that slice of cake. And so do they have more or less agency than me? I don't know.
Sounds great on the surface level to not have to battle that, to go up and just go out and run or do whatever you have to do. So go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I was talking about this with my wife this morning, that if you don't have that monologue, what is consciousness like? Right? Because consciousness is at its core the awareness that you are thinking. And so I don't know what the experience of the two people that I heard this, like, what would it be like to be in their minds? And I certainly don't think there is a better or worse. It's just, I know what consciousness is to me, but it makes me more aware that my consciousness is not necessarily what other people's consciousness is.
That's very interesting. That's one of my nebulous thoughts about the story of Adam and Eve, is that it was an attempt to describe how humans developed consciousness. But I've heard you talk about maybe through Yosha Bach, the story of Adam and Eve. That's pretty interesting. Would you?
Yeah. So, so he's a guest I've had on my podcast. He's a philosopher that's from Germany. He's got this very unusual voice and this German accent, but he's brilliant. And if you ask him questions about like, how do our minds work? He comes up with these metaphors that you're like, that was sitting in front of me all these years and I never knew it. And one of them was when he described Adam and Eve. That story of the Garden of Eden is actually the experience of childhood. You're born into it. Everything is perfect. You are naming the animals. You're learning how the world works. And that forbidden fruit that you're not supposed to bite into is like the knowledge of good and evil. And when they take a bite of it, they have to leave the garden and they can never go back. And now, being a father, I can see very clearly my children are perfectly innocent, right? Everything you tell them, they believe, and they are pure of heart and spirited, and everything is good. But there will come a time, and as a father, you have to prepare them for that time when they're going to realize, oh, there's evil in the world. And if I'm not aware and prepared for that evil, it will get me. It will bite me like a snake. And so this metaphor was sitting there. I mean, how many times did you hear the story of the Garden of Eden, right?
Hundreds.
And I never imagined that. And I like, as a party trick now at dinners, will be like, you ever thought about the fact that the Garden of Eden is a metaphor for childhood? And you watch people's brains just like melt right there on the table. But like Yosha Bach is just filled with those kinds of metaphors that help you understand a world that's sitting right there.
How are you preparing your children for a world that has evil in it?
I love the innocence, right? In fact, one of the best parts about being a parent is that you get to revisit the Garden of Eden and you get to see it through their eyes. And you have, my 4-year-old is now starting to develop agency, right? She's realized when she's talking with the neighbor lady, if the neighbor says, no, you can't come in and play the piano today, she can push back against that, right? And so she's starting to develop like, oh, well, I have a will and I can keep pushing, and every once in a while I'm going to get what I want. So you have to, the preparation that you have for her is, how do you make it so you push back against the world, so you don't just accept what it is that they have for you, but that you don't then push your way through a door that you fall into a hole where you're going somewhere you shouldn't be. And so for me, the first step is like helping her navigate how do we interact. And one of the most important things, in fact, this was like one of my first choices as a parent, was she was born right around the time that COVID was going on and people were wearing masks. And so if we had a workman come over to the house or we had somebody stop by, they were trying to be polite by wearing masks. And I, as a communicator, somebody that like deeply resonates with people's body language, with the tone of their voice, I was realizing that my child was having almost all of that communication cut away. And as a little girl, she needs to learn as quickly as possible how to read things that are there. Is this person safe? Is this person not safe? Is this person somebody that's worthy of trust, or is there something off about them that I want to be wary of? So I had to make the choice. At the time, we didn't know if masks helped or not. Do I want to expose her to the danger of getting sick, or do I want to blind her from the emotions and signals that she could pick up? And we had to choose, and we chose pick up those signals, because I think for a woman, that what you think of as intuitive is not intuitive. It's actually trained in you at a young age. And so we were exposing her to potential disease in the hopes that she would be prepared to read people's emotions.
Wow. What was the criteria for that when you're weighing those two things against each other? This disease that could, that supposedly could kill people, or this inability to perceive danger and could put you into very dangerous situations. Like, how did you decide that?
At the end of the day, it's the exact thing we started with. It's that voice inside of your head. And I was watching my child, when we took her to church, not interact with the people that were around her that were making googly eyes, right? And at church, this is like a core function of church, is that you mix small children with little old ladies and that gruff guy. And one of the things that happens when you have a child is all of a sudden you see the softer side of people. That gruff guy doesn't make googly eyes at you. And, that little old lady, she's not paying attention to you. But when there's a child, all of a sudden they're interacting with that child. And I was noticing this is not causing that spark that I've seen when I was growing up, and that I look around and see is not happening with anybody. And that became something that permeated my dreams, was something I talked with my wife a lot about. And very quickly we came to the conclusion, like, that spark is one of the things that makes me who I am. And we can very clearly see that that is my daughter. And so we wanted to make her have the best advantage that we could.
That's amazing. To keep in the theme of the Bible and church, like, that's to some degree, the Abraham and Isaac story is, he goes and sacrifices his son Isaac to God. And to me, it almost seems like it's telling you, hey, simply by having children, you're going to have to sacrifice them to the world, because one way or another, they're going to gain consciousness, and you're going to have to give them away. So and then I guess when you look at things like this, when I look at stories like Abraham, in that way, when I look at the Garden of Eden in the way that you described, the Bible makes a lot more sense to me in terms of metaphors, in terms of these are stories on how to conduct ourselves, but maybe not historically accurate. You mentioned that you take your daughters to church. Is that a very important
Actually, no,
thing?
I don't. My wife does, and we went for a little while. I have this extreme ambivalence about religion. So for me, I grew up in the Catholic Church, and going to church was an exercise of me counting the ceiling boards in there, and but most of my religious education actually came from me. I first had a picture Bible, and I was totally obsessed with it. It was like a comic book, and I read it end to end. Oh, I got it for First Communion.
Okay.
So
6, 7 years
yeah,
old,
something like that. And so I actually internalized the Bible stories at a way deeper level than any of my Sunday school teachers, probably than my priests. Like, I knew all the stories of Boaz and Judah and all these stories. And I found the religious exercise of saying these chants and singing these songs to be something that's repellent to me. I am naturally predisposed to not wanting to follow people. I have an instinct about mobs are incredibly dangerous. Charismatic leaders are people I want to avoid. Like, I never want to be swept up in things. But that wasn't always true. For a small period of time when I was in high school, I was involved in this group called Teens Encounter Christ, and it was a Catholic organization. It was very helpful to me. At the time, it kept me from becoming like a drinker in school and hanging out with bad kids. So it had a lot of benefits to me. But then as I got older again, I remember I was riding on a bus to a job I was working paving in to pay for college. And there was this little old lady that I would see every single day. We'd sit next to each other. I started talking with her. And it turns out she worked like 3 jobs. Her life was incredibly difficult. Her children were in and out of drug rehab. And she was like working incredibly hard. And the whole time she was sitting there saying, I know it's hard now, but Jesus is going to repay me in the end in heaven. And I was like, this is a trick. This is a trick that you are having played on you, to get you to work hard, to sacrifice all this stuff. And if there's nothing there, you became a slave or a servant to these people. Now, as a 42-year-old, I can understand maybe that's the story that she needed to tell herself to make the right kind of sacrifices to make this thing all work. But when I go to church, I don't feel the connection or the desire to be connected with people the way that others do. And so my wife and I have worked out an arrangement where she takes the girls to church, and I spend time reading them a lot, ostensibly out of the Bible, but other books, and trying to impute knowledge. But for my wife, it was very beneficial to go to church. It made her who she is. It's a very important part. So this is a ever constant tension in our relationship.
That's very interesting. If it's a tension, but you guys presumably went into that relationship and you got married saying, at some level, okay, we are on the same page about these values and these values. For a lot of people I know, that would be enough to cut it off. They need to both be Muslim, or they need to both be Christian, or whatever it is. So was that something you had to get through, or was that
Well, there's a funny story there. So my wife and I dated. We were introduced on a blind date, and the person that introduced us and told Ann, I met this nice Catholic boy, because I'd gone to Marquette University. I'd gone to Seton Hall. And so they were like, oh, we met this. And when my wife asked me about it, I answered in the way that I always did. She says I was being clever. I just say I was born in a family, Irish Catholic family of 7, went to church. So she was reading that as, you still go to church, this is the way you feel. So we went on 6 or so dates, and then somehow during the last date, it came out I'm like, no, I don't go to church. I'm not interested in that. I don't have I'm agnostic at best. And she basically was like, get out of the car. And I was like, what? And she's like, we're done. And she gets out and she drives off, and I call my good friend, and I'm like, man, this woman that I thought was just amazing in every single way, she just caught a bullet train to Crazy Town. And we didn't talk for a couple of weeks, and then we reconnected and figured it out.
How'd you reconnect? Was it you reaching out or her?
Yeah, I think I called her up and was like, or texted or something, and was like, hey, really? We really had a good spark here. What's going on? And ultimately, the thing that's true is that we both were raised Catholic, and that allowed for a lot of deeply shared values that made it so we could work together. So what we believe about what is truth, what are you responsible for? How do families operate? All of these things are embedded in the culture of Catholicism, and so we shared those. And the reason I say it's a struggle is because as a mom, she's trying to take 2 little girls that don't want to pay attention in church, and they need the dad to be like, sit still.
Yeah.
And I'm not super willing to demonstrate to my children that I think that they should be going through this ceremony. But I'm ambivalent about this. Sometimes I think maybe I really should do it.
Maybe you really should do it in the sense that, the despite what the truth of the tree is, it bears fruit, and it's worthwhile endeavor regardless. I hear that a lot, actually, that same argument, because I'm embedded in a pretty Christian community right now. And I'm the outlier, the agnostic to some degree. Even though that I think I hold Christian values more so than a lot of the people that I see. But one of the main arguments is, I choose to participate because it's bearing these fruits. And I can't exactly explain it, but I'm participating anyway. And I guess the pushback that I have to that is Santa Claus to some, I've used this example before, and I don't mean it to be degrading or whatever, but the fruits of Santa Claus are good. If there's a naughty and nice list, and if I believe in Santa Claus and believe he's going to bring me good presents, then I'll act better throughout the year. And so I can look at that and go, well, the fruits of this are good, but I wouldn't want Sean or Jake over here to be believing in Santa Claus. There's something that I feel like you're missing out on that. I really struggle to know whether it's something worth arguing with people about, or pushing people to become agnostic, and because that feels like it's searching for truth. What do you hear in that?
Well, two things. Like one, there is such thing as like a meta truth, like a truth that is true, even though the action that you're taking isn't real. Like I use the example of, one of the reasons that Islam accelerated and the people that followed Islam really succeeded was that they started washing 5 times a day. And if you're in a climate and in a culture where things are dirty and you don't have time, or it's really expensive to use fresh, clean water to clean yourself, then you don't do it. But now all of a sudden the call to prayer requires that you wash first. Well, now they're washing their hands 5 times a day, and suddenly their families aren't getting sick. Suddenly they can work more. Suddenly the fruits of their labor bear more fruit. And so you could say like, oh, look, when we started praying, oh, look, God started shining favor on us. And the same thing is true of when we started washing ourselves. I think this is true of many things that Christians or Catholics in particular believe, right? Being cognizant of how your sins hurt someone else and going to confession and saying, I'm going to bring these to mind. I'm going to put them to words. So I'm going to actually have to like search through my mind and say, is my conscience clean? Did I make right with God? And making that a perpetual thing. If you're taking communion, you had better not have a mortal sin on your soul. And if you have to go tell it to somebody, that's going to make you not want to do that thing again. Because if you keep having to go into the priest and tell him the same thing over and over again, it just makes you more and more conscious of it. Mm-hmm. So the meta truth is your family gets better, you stop drinking alcohol, or you stop doing these things. So maybe the action is very valuable. So I have that deeply embedded in me that there are meta truths that I can't understand, and you just live them out through it.
Yeah, you as far as like you mentioned that you learned these values through stories to start, right? And then now you have kind of perpetuated that out into what you're doing now. What are the value of stories, and how are you finding that through what you're doing with legacy interviews?
So stories, everything in my life, and I believe almost everyone's lives, is what you know about the world is in the form of a story. Even if you know it from a scientific level, right? Like we're so deeply into stories that we look for causation in everything, right? Where did that come from? Why did it happen? And we listen to stories with rapt attention because we're like, I want to know either how to achieve the place that you're at or to avoid the problem you're telling me about. And we're so addicted to it that we'll find ourselves watching TV screens that we can't hear anything to be like, is there a story there? Is there something going on I need to know? And so stories are the thing that are the way we transmit all knowledge, and it's just a part of who we are, right? It's what allowed us to outcompete animals that were faster or stronger than us, because we could tell each other a story about how we were going to handle things and then go out and hunt together or go out and, achieve some larger purpose. Really, having any group of we necessitates that you have a story, because we is like, what is the story we tell ourselves to say why we are connected? And so I have been, I love telling stories. When I worked at various organizations, I became a professional storyteller, standing up and telling people stories that were different than the ones they had in their heads. And then now in my work, doing legacy interviews, which is where I sit down and record individuals and couples telling their stories, I've discovered that if you want to capture someone as they are, if you want to get that spark of who mom and dad really are, you can't just sit there and be like, we're just going to film you, right? What it requires is them telling their stories so that they come alive, so that they revisit like, we endured this terrible thing, this bankruptcy or these challenges, or we overcame these things, and that's where the spark of a human being comes out, and that's what we capture.
That's right, yeah, because if you're just saying, well, I grew up in this town and I grew up here and here, that's very logical, but when you start bringing those stories in, the emotional part of your brain becomes attached to that. How did you get good at telling stories in the first place?
I'm the middle child of 7. And I was not the smartest. I wasn't the prettiest. I wasn't the fastest or strongest. And what I realized from watching my father was that if you prompt people to tell you about themselves, the world opens up to you in ways that are really magical. And so I would watch my dad in a grocery store or at a restaurant, find a way to ask a person a question that was not intrusive at all. It woke them up to being like, oh, I'm here. I'm a conscious person. And this person wants to know what I'm experiencing. I call them cashier questions, but like my dad would be, doing the checkout, and it'd be, let's say 8:00 at night. And he would say, is the things that people are buying at 8:00 at night different than what they buy at 8 a.m.? And the register person would have to think about that. And then they'd be like, yeah, people buy a lot more single servings of ice cream and booze at 8:00 at night, right? Whereas at 8:00 in the morning, they're buying for a whole family, right? And so this person that's doing this mundane job now has a view on what's going on around them that's unique to them. They've just been asked about it. This person has just shown that they care. They laugh at that observation, or they, now have that thing in common. And now my father, every time he comes through that line, has an electricity or resonance with that person. And so I saw that and absorbed it and probably implemented it on a scale that now probably exceeds where my father was on it.
Wow, that's amazing. That's to some degree, or to a lot of degree, probably is what connected you and I of that being our thing. And it is like, if people can learn that, it is a totally life-altering thing, to where you can go to any city, you can go to any room, and you can become the most important person in the room almost by making it about other people. You and I kind of came together and started a project that we're working on right now as far as communications. What is that?
So you are one of those people that, like, you prompt people to do things that are uncomfortable. And you had noticed, because we've spent a lot of time together, like, hey, you have all these communications ideas. You're always like pointing out how to do it. I think we should record these and put them on YouTube. And I had already been talking about a lot of these ideas because I get invited around the country to go give talks. And my talks usually are to agriculture groups. Mm-hmm. And I don't generally say, hey, I'm going to come and talk to you about how to have better fights with your wife, right? They don't want that. What I talk about is, hey, let me tell you about the changing wave of culture and what you need to do in order to be able to understand how that culture is going to change. And what I'm essentially, I show them about how culture is changing. And then I say the way that you're going to find out how it's changing is by talking with people that are different than you, by having a group of people that are disagreeable and they don't always just accept what you say. Well, and how do you develop that? Well, you develop that by listening in this way, by being open and having your ideas challenged and asking better questions. And so I had a lot of these ideas, but they were ideas that I could develop over an entire hour, and I could have people flow with me on this. And when you started saying, we got to get this into 60 seconds, it forced me to do something I had never really done before, which is like to crystallize the idea, to distill it all the way down to its purest essence. And after we did this, we started seeing people really react well to this. And so that led to, like, well, maybe we should be putting this into a class where you take these distilled ideas and show somebody enough of these ideas that they could do it themselves. Because it's not any one thing. It's not like one conversation trick that'll open up the world. It's understanding the basics of, like, why does somebody share with you? How does changing the way you ask a question or the way that you react to somebody, how does that help them open up? So we built a class called Interest-Based Communicating. And instead of starting the class where everybody does is like, we're going to work on introductions, we start on interest-based negotiating, which is what I have a graduate degree in. It's what I've spent a lot of time studying, which is, how do I find out what you want and need? Because if I know that, then it's more likely that you, and I can meet it, I can give you what you want and need, you're going to be way more likely to give me what I want and need. And that's what we're doing all the time, trying to navigate, how we can find shared interests. So we start there, and then we move to introductions, because it's only after you understand that the reason I'm doing this introduction is to launch us into a conversation where we can share and we can figure out how we can work together. So after that introductions class, people start having this realization like, oh, I'm not just telling you a linear series of events. I'm telling you what you need to know to be able to ask me a question that starts us on this path. And then the next class is on conversation and how to ask great questions, something that's intuitive for you, but really thinking about if somebody is not a question asker because they're an introvert or they're a person that, has this internal dialogue that's going so much they can't pay attention, what could you teach a person about how to be more meditative, more relaxed in that? And then we talk about conflict, and then we talk about negotiating in a complex environment where maybe I'm negotiating with you, but you aren't the decision maker. You have to go to somebody else. So how do you find alignment in all of that? And so that class in collection is basically the distilled ideas of communication.
That's great. Yeah, I'm right now. I'm in like the level of playing the game of I'm looking for feedback from someone, and they don't want to hurt my feelings or feel like they will hurt my feelings, and so now I have to play that game of, okay, how do we get them to truthfully say that, to your point of that next level. But so arguably these skills, were they refined at Monsanto when you were working there?
Monsanto was an amazing challenge for me. That was an exceptional thing because there's a few times in your life where you go in thinking, I know how this works, and then you get flipped upside down and you're like, wait, everything I thought I knew was wrong, and now you have this truth, or you have this knowledge, or you have this understanding, and everyone else you know thinks the way that you used to. And so I had this opportunity. So when I went to interview for the job of Monsanto, I had no interest in the job. The only reason I did the interview was because I thought, well, who doesn't want to see inside of North Korea?
So what was going on there? What was going on with Monsanto that it was problematic in the first place?
Yeah, at the time, Monsanto was this big ag company. Some people might say a giant ag company, but in terms of size, it was only about 20,000 people. So for corporations, that's actually not that big of a company. But they were the number one company, and they had developed genetically engineered crops and a few chemistries, the one that everybody knows about, Roundup, which is glyphosate. And so they had only sold to farmers. And what the world doesn't realize is farmers loved Monsanto. I mean, sure, there are a few that didn't, but Monsanto delivered them opportunities to make money, to be more productive, to allow their farm to survive when labor costs were going up and they couldn't keep their farm if they had to do all this labor. And so when the world started turning against them, when you started having protests, millions against Monsanto, or these GMOs are what are killing the bees, Monsanto just ignored it because they were like, doesn't matter. The protests aren't keeping our farmer customers from buying our products. We don't care. So they let that go for years and years and years, and the water just kept getting hotter and hotter and hotter until one day they were like, wait a second, we are going to lose our ability to sell these products, and we don't know how to go out and do this. Now they'd waited so long that when they sent scientists out there, scientists would get booed, or scientists would communicate like, let me show you the facts, and I'm going to prove to you that this is right or wrong. So they decided they were going to hire people to reach out to the groups they thought they needed to change. And they came up with the idea that we need to reach out to moms, millennials, and foodies, which is a very PR thing to do, right? And so they decided that they were going to hire a person that for each one of those groups. So they hired some like dietitian chef people. They hired a person that would reach out to moms, and they needed a millennial engagement person. And so they were hiring for this. And I thought that was just the funniest thing I'd ever heard in my life. And so I took the interview thinking like, this is going to be great. I'm going to go in and do an interview for a job I don't want, which I don't know if you've ever done that. But that's about as much fun as you can possibly have, right? Because people are asking you questions and it doesn't matter what you say because you don't want the job. Mm-hmm. And so I went in there imagining I was going to find this 80-story building with black storm clouds all around and that everybody would be wearing black suits and Matrix-style sunglasses. And what I found was it's a 2-story college campus with a fountain, and the woman that greeted me at the door had a ponytail and her name was Holly. Right, like this is mind-shattering to me. And then they proceeded to put me through seven interviews, an hour long each, so 7 hours of interviews. And every time they would ask me questions like, well, what's your preferred management style? And I'd be like, I like to get into work early. Why are you guys killing all the bees? You know, like, and then they'd answer very genuinely their perspective on it. And then they'd say, you know, tell us a little bit about how you manage people. And then I'd give them an answer. And then I'd be like, why are you forcing Indian farmers to kill themselves? And I did this to them for 7 straight hours. And I had a blast. And I assumed that I was going to come out and write a blog about it or something, right? I was running a communications company. That's what I was imagining before I went in there. Well, I get all the way done, and Holly comes back into the room and sits across the table from me and says, all right, we've just done these interviews. We've asked you all these questions. Do you have any questions for me? And I was like, yeah, you're hiring a person to go out and talk to millennials who hate Monsanto. They know that Monsanto is evil. How are you going to train a person to do this job? And she paused and said something that changed the trajectory of my life. She said, well, at Monsanto, we train people based on what their skill set is. And they did. Monsanto was actually a national treasure. The way that they encouraged people to harness their scientific knowledge is truly amazing. But I didn't know this at the time. So she says, we are going to train people, whoever we hire, based on their skill set. And since you've been so curious, I think what I would do is I would write a list of 50 people from throughout the company, chemists, breeders, geneticists, farmers, lawyers, and I'd let you sit down and talk with each one of them for an hour. And then after you get done with that list of 50 people, then you and I'll sit down. We'll figure out what you do and don't know, and I'll write another list of 50 people. And I was like, you people have no idea what I can do if I get to run around here and ask anyone anything that I want. So I went instantly from thinking this was a job that I didn't want, that I was going to write a blog about, to now being like, well, one of two things is going to happen. You are either going to discover that this is the most evil company that everybody thinks that it is, and then I'm going to go write the greatest tell-all book of all time, or you're going to discover that what you thought you knew about agriculture, about how we're growing food and how it's being produced, is wrong, in which case you've just uncovered the most interesting communications problem maybe in the history of modern civilization. So I went from not wanting this job to thinking, this is the most amazing opportunity of my life. So I ended up taking the job, and then I interviewed with probably 300 people. I probably did, 6 different sessions over a series of months, and came to the conclusion that I knew literally nothing about our food system before. Whatever documentaries I'd read, whatever books I'd understood, whatever clips I'd seen on YouTube.
How did you come to that conclusion?
Well, because you're just, every question you have, you're talking to somebody and you're saying, why do you spray this chemical that everybody says causes cancer? Why are you using this? And then you discover, well, let me show you what the other chemistries are that are out there. Let me show you what happens if, let's just take glyphosate off the table. What are the other chemistries out there, and what are the problems with them? One of the problems of a chemistry that you could use, like dicamba, which is one of the replacements they use for glyphosate, is, well, it takes 15 days for that chemical to break down and not be something that you track around on your feet or wipe on your hands. Glyphosate, as soon as it is put onto the plant, starts breaking down. And whereas many of these other chemistries were designed to burn the plant or kill it in some kind of dramatic way, what glyphosate does is it actually signals to the plant, it's full. Stop producing anything else, and we're just going to shut down. And so it shuts down the plant and tells it, like, it's summer's over, we're done. And then as soon as it hits water, the molecule breaks apart into salt and to some phosphate, and it's way gentler. And so you start hearing these things and you start saying, like, why didn't anybody tell me that, right? Like, why is that not something I knew? And then you start doing it with literally every single aspect of agriculture that you've ever heard about, and you realize, like, everything I thought I knew has a different perspective. And certainly I was hearing Monsanto's perspective, but then I had the opportunity to go out and talk about this. And my position was, I don't care if you burn this, building to the ground. Like, if this company is bad, I want to know that. So I would go out and say, guys, this is what I'm hearing. This is what I know. Do you know anything I don't know? And you guys tell me, ask me your questions. And if I don't know the answer, then I'm going to go find out. And if we discover that there's something that you guys know about how evil they are that I haven't been able to figure out, well, then we're on the same side. So it gave me a chance to have dialogue with people that was very intense and very intentional and very exciting, and the stakes were always very high. So for me, it was like taking a drug.
How did people respond to that? So was the response when you started doing that, did exactly what needed to happen?
Not at first, no, because the worst presentation, the biggest I've ever bombed, right? So, you hear comedians talk about bombing and how bad it was. Like my first bombing was the very first talk I ever gave. And it was because the PR firm had built this like presentation that was like perfect. And they were like, we're going to send this out with you. And we've already message tested it with moms, millennials, and foodies. And we know that every single color is right. And, it's all perfect. And so I was invited to the ag college at Iowa State. There was a sustainable ag program there. And they invited me to come give a presentation. And I'm thinking, this is awesome. This is the home team. You're going to Iowa State University and talking to the ag school. This is going to be great. So it was a 2-hour seminar. And I remember right before I walked into that room, I was talking to our joint friend, Rob Long. And he was like, dude, if you can't win over the crowd at Iowa State, you should quit your job. Right? So I walk in there. And as soon as I come in, I'm like, you guys don't look like the ag kids that I knew, but whatever. And so I give the presentation, right? And it is a stadium style room. It's pretty well filled. There's teachers in there. There's students. And I had just worked with one student who was just sweet as can be when we were setting it up. And I give the presentation and I'm thinking, I want to get to Q&A as fast as I can because we're going to have a blast during the questions. So I go through this presentation, like we all know we need to feed the world growing population. Here's the benefit of GMOs. This is the value of, pesticides. This is how much we can grow so much more on land in this amount of space. Click, 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 click. I get done with this presentation in 15 minutes. And so I'm thinking I got an hour and 45 minutes to have a great Q&A. And I say, okay, are there any questions? And a woman all the way at the back of the lecture hall, all the way up, raises her arms straight up. And I'm like, yes, you there. And she goes, I don't believe a word out of your mouth. And the whole crowd starts cheering and clapping.
My gosh.
The teachers are like delighted. And that's when I realized I was not where I thought I was.
So was that on you, or was it that this was an audience that...
It was both, because I later went to audiences that were just like this. What I found out later was that at the ag college at Iowa State, there had been a group that had broken off from the ag school and said, we believe in sustainable ag, which is very different than the large scale ag. And these people were more talking about social issues than they were about how do you grow productive crops, what are the challenges and constraints. And so a lot of it was more social theory than it was about actual agronomics and how does the chemistry work. And so they were there thinking, we just got Monsanto to walk in here. So I was like, could you be more specific? And she's like, yeah, like, why are you poisoning farmers? Why are you killing the bees? Why are you all the things that I had said? And now I'm like, okay, I don't know what I'm going to do because I am not prepared to have 200 people be angry at me. Right. And so I ended up writing what she was saying on the blackboard. Because I was like, I need to buy some time. I don't know what to do here. People are cheering for me to fail here. And I get done writing down all of her stuff. I'm like, is that what you were saying? And she's like, yes. And I'm like, do you guys have other questions besides all these that I've written up on there? And they were like, yeah. And I was like, okay, I've got an idea. How about I agree that I will not leave until I have answered these questions behind me to the best of my ability. But if I answer them one at a time, it's just going to come off as me being defensive and it not working. So do you have other things that you're concerned about? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, how about we take them one at a time and I try my best to answer the questions. And then if by the time I'm done, I haven't answered all of these, I'll just stay behind. And they ended up agreeing to that. And so we took questions one at a time. And there were things when I would say, like I had a woman ask me, like, how do you know that GMOs don't cause autism? And I would say, I have looked at the studies that people are saying work, and people have pointed out to me flaws in those, but I can't actually read this paper. I don't really know. So I have some amount of faith that it doesn't. But because she was saying, I have an autistic child, are you certain that it wasn't the GMOs? And I think the fact that I was willing to say, I don't know, or I can't, be assured, allowed people to have a different interaction with me. And that's when I came to the conclusion, I'm not here to defend Monsanto. I'm here to learn along with these people and share what I know. And from then on, for the rest of my time, 5 years, I traveled all over the world and would be in hot audiences, but everything ended up being like, I'm just telling you as best I can.
Wow. That's, you've described a lot about, I don't know if fear is the right word, but fear of mobs and how it's the most powerful force in the world. You had previously been in the Peace Corps in Kenya, and you had seen mobs there. Did that prepare you for handling a mob right in front of you that is focused on you specifically?
Yeah, so you're making reference to the fact that, like, on my podcast, every few months I will come out and give something where I'm like,
Warning
seriously,
about the mob,
guys,
yeah.
like, mobs are the most dangerous force on earth. Once they are unleashed, there's no stopping them. And I came very clear. I had natural intuition about this probably my whole life. But when I was in Kenya, I had seen two situations where people felt like justice was not happening, that they were being robbed and that there were robbers out there and the police weren't coming to help. And so they set up a vigilante group that was patrolling. And when that vigilante group didn't find any robbers, they started whispering to each other, well, maybe it's those new guys that came in that town over. And I heard they were in prison. And, so people started whipping themselves up. And you could see this happening over about 2 weeks until one morning I woke up and people are cheering and clapping. You can hear the whole village lighting up, and it turns out that they had decided that it was two guys in a town over that had been released from prison that were causing these robberies. So they went to their homes with literal machetes and torches and demanded they send those two guys out. They drugged them back to the center of town. They put tires over them. They poured kerosene on them and they lit them on fire.
And you watched this?
I did not see that. No, I came after the fact where you could see the burned tires and the tire marks, and there was nothing left of those people. And ultimately, you see, people did this because they were afraid, and now they had this jubilation. It's the thing that Rene Girard talks about having scapegoats and this fear, and then put it all on them and burn them. That's exactly what it was. And another time I saw somebody get accused of being mwezi, a thief. And the whole crowd came running forward, grabbed the guy, didn't wait to see if he had the goods on him or anything, started punching him, kicking him, and I assume he was dead. And I was sitting there thinking, in that situation, well, what do you do? Because if I go in there to try and stop them from kicking him to death, they may kick me to death, and there's no stopping this. And the people, once they're done, they just dissipate. They're just gone.
It's like a peace almost in the air.
Yeah,
I imagine.
and so seeing this is something that has let me know, those people in Africa are no different than the people here, and that we are prone to this. We desire this. This is something deeply embedded in us. Girard talks about Christianity being the only way out of this, that Jesus became the scapegoat, so we don't need to sacrifice anybody else to appease the gods. But I now see it in the world. And for you to bring that up as seeing a mob, yeah, I think I watched that build and felt the electricity. I mean, had I not found a way to calm that group of people down, they would have continued to build into that. Now, I don't think they'd have kicked me to death, but I think if you make people afraid enough, then you tell them there's something hidden in that drink and it's poisoning you, and that's what's causing all your problems. Well, you are going to go find out who's doing that to you, and you will not use ration and logic and science. You'll use your gut feeling.
So is the answer to, is glyphosate, making my children autistic, and is it killing the bees, and is it giving us cancer and all these things? Is the answer, I don't know, or is there a succinct, here's exactly what, what everyone got wrong. Here's what people misunderstand about Monsanto.
So I have probably a more nuanced view than even when I worked at Monsanto. If you look at the studies about glyphosate, it is far and away the most gentle chemical that we use in agriculture. There's nothing that compares to it. And for how effective it is making it so you don't have to send laborers out into the field, and that you are using a chemical that dissipates. You can only detect it at the parts per billion in that soil. But you can find small parts or residual parts in your Cheerios and in different, products that are out there. So it is there. But as far as compared to what, it is a lot better than everything else. And there is no reasonable study that's been done and replicated that says it has any consequence towards cancer or autism or these things. So as far as I know, if we're using science, it is indicated that is not the culprit of a lot of the problems that we see. That being said, I had a fascinating conversation with a guy named Laszlo Barabasi, who's the father of network science. And he basically talks about how there are a lot of things that happen in a complex world that if you're looking only at the view of science, which has to isolate things one at a time, is this one molecule causally, connected to this other thing, then, when you look at it like this, you maybe say, well, no. But if you zoom the camera lens back and you start saying, well, biology is actually a series of networks of chemistry that are all networked together. Is it possible that glyphosate or other things as a collective are doing things that we don't know and understand? The answer is you've got to say, well, I don't know. And in fact, no one knows. In fact, I was talking just on a podcast called Talking Biotech the other day, talking with one of the leading scientists in the United States about agriculture and biotechnology. And even he will admit, you're right. We can't study really complex things in that way. And so that's something to be aware of. But I think before people give in and say, well, we should just ban glyphosate to be on the safe side, you have to understand that the trade-off is you're going to use another chemical or you're going to send people out into those fields. And there's all sorts of other consequences that go into that. The people that die of skin cancer or of the labor injuries or just of toiling their lives, spending their entire time weeding. If we want to say that's what we want, fine. But that's the trade-off. And you have to understand that everything is a trade-off.
Would that make food more expensive too?
Dramatically more expensive. Yeah. But, I heard a fascinating thing about, I like something is clearly wrong with our food system, like clearly wrong, right? You look around and people are really overweight and people suffer from diabetes and Alzheimer's is wildly out of control. But I think that it is likely a network of things that are going on there, right? We're trying to produce food as cheaply as possible. We're trying to give it preservatives so that it lasts as long as possible because the value of our dollars keeps going down and down and down. And so you have to make more dollars to get these things. So of course I'm going to want bread that lasts 2 weeks rather than 1 week or than a half a week. And so what's going on with preservatives? And you have to ask yourself, like, what's going on when we started changing our diets to say, oh, fat, that's bad. That's what's making you fat. And we way increase the amount of sugars that are in things. And I think all of these things collectively are adding up to a really complicated problem to solve. But there are always going to be people that come around that are going to say, let me tell you, I know what the one problem is. And if we end that one problem, if we all gather together like a mob and we end that one problem, all these things are going to go away. But the reality is, if you get rid of, say, glyphosate, these problems will still be there. And then those people that pointed that problem, they're going to point at another problem and then another problem. And it's not going to get us closer to solving the problem, but it is going to keep them in power.
What do you think about RFK and his movement? Is that something... do you think that's heading in the right direction, or do you think that is potentially turning into a mob?
I think that is a very volatile situation. And I find myself being deeply conflicted because there are massive changes that need to come to agriculture to fix the food system. But my impression of RFK, the way that he made his money was by doing these class action lawsuits. And class action lawsuits have a valuable contribution to society. What it does is it takes David and it makes it so if he's fighting against Goliath, he can go find a bunch more Davids and they can pool their resources and they can fight Goliath, right? So we need this class action lawsuit to be out there. But class action lawsuits have turned into big business. Mm-hmm. And what people don't realize is if you want to start a class action lawsuit, you go find 10 people that say, my cancer was caused because of this drug that I took or this baby powder that I used or whatever it is. You've got 10 people. Now you find an attorney that says, okay, well, we could actually grow this and we could get more money for our legal fees if we go out and find people that would invest in this. So what let's do is...
So you can get investments for a class action lawsuit.
And it is big business.
Wow.
So imagine conference rooms in Las Vegas where people are at conventions where you go and you hear people give keynotes about, hey, we've gotten these people together and they have this problem. And if you invest in our fund, we may make a payout of $1 billion times 10 or times whatever. So invest in our project. And then investors invest in it. And then you take that money and you put it up in billboards and you put it up in late night ads. And you say, did you use baby powder between these 2 years? And did you develop cancer? Well, call us today and we'll get you lined up. Well, RFK is a part of that larger system. And that larger system figured out for a while they were investing in anti-GMO. I don't know if you've noticed there's no money going towards anti-GMO because that used to be what they were funneling money towards. And then they realized, oh, wait, we can get a class action lawsuit set up around glyphosate. Now we're going to take all the money from anti-GMO and we are going to pump it towards glyphosate because we're getting billion-dollar payouts here. And so these multi-billion-dollar payouts
from the
lawsuit,
from
Bears
and
and so Bayer bought that company right as they were getting these huge lawsuits. And so now what's happening as a result of this is there are no new chemistries coming to market, because if you can knock glyphosate out, then who in their right mind would spend 10 years, hundreds of millions of dollars developing a new chemistry only to get it through the regulatory system that's going to take you 10 or 15 more years, only to have it then be the downfall of your company because you get sued by the big business of class action lawsuits. So all of this to say, when I look at RFK, I see a person that leveraged the class action lawsuits to make himself wealthy. And I don't necessarily agree that for the cases that he was involved in, that they had as much merit as they made money on them. And I think that he is likely doing this again with glyphosate and trying to push these changes. That said, something needs to happen to change how we are incentivizing corn and soy in the United States. Because without changing that, we are not going to make our food system better, and we're going to keep feeding the cheapest food possible to the poorest people. They are going to continue to have diabetes and obesity and all the problems that go with that, and it will keep them enslaved and at the bottom of our civilization. So if we don't change that, we are enslaving people to cheap food.
Change what exactly?
Well, I mean, my belief starts upstream of ag, and it is that one of the reasons that we are producing such cheap food is because the value of our dollars is going down. And the reason the value of our dollars is going down is because the government, instead of taxing us to pay for whatever programs they're promising people, whatever money they're sending to the Ukraine, whatever projects and all of this, instead of taxing people, they print more money. And when they print more money, that means there's more money in the system. So the money that you have earned and put in the bank, the value of it goes down. And so the cost of things goes up, how much you're paying for eggs or milk or whatever. So then people are saying, I'm willing to buy cheaper and cheaper food, the food that has more additives in it, food that was made with sugar that was highly processed, with oils that maybe, aren't as whole as some of the other ones. And so to me, the only way you fix the agriculture system is if you fix the money, and that is to make it so that the government cannot print money, because this is the way that they are able to fund anything that they want, by taxing us in this silent tax that nobody voted on.
Yeah, that feels very bleak. It feels like, what are we supposed to do? How do we get the government to stop printing money then?
They will never stop. And so my belief is that Bitcoin is the most important technology, certainly in our lifetimes, probably in the last several generations, because it provides an off-ramp where we can say there is a way to store value that cannot be printed more of. I always make the comparison that one of the reasons land prices just keep going up is because people with large amounts of money don't want to keep investing into the stock market. They don't want to buy artwork. They don't want to buy gold. And so what are they doing? They want to buy something that is finite so that the value of their dollars stay put. And so they're buying farmland. And that farmland, the price of it just keeps going up way beyond what we call the utility price. So the utility price is how much can you make by growing corn or raising cattle or pigs on this property. And so now the price of that land makes it so just owning that land and producing on it isn't actually a return on your investment, because all this money floods in from the financial markets that say, we just want a place where our money isn't being degraded.
They're just letting it sit there pretty much. They're
so they
not
just
doing
invest
it for
into
the
that.
farming. Okay.
Then they hire a farm manager,
Yep.
and that farm manager says, all right, I'm going to produce as much crops on this as I can, or I'm going to do whatever this group wants me to do. And it's not a farmer sitting there saying, I'm going to own this land for the next 100 years with my family, so I want to treat it with the absolute most respect. That's not a denigration on farm managers. It's just saying, if you own the land that you are working on, you are going to treat it differently than if you are a manager of property that you are managing on behalf of somebody else.
Why is that important?
Well, because they will treat it differently, right? Like if you are living on a farm and you know you're going to pass that farm down to your kids, you're not going to use a chemical that, maybe is good for 5 years, but after 5 years it's depleted your soil in some way. Or you're not going to do practices that allow you to get as much money out of that land as you can to pay the taxes on it. You're going to treat it in a different way. So I bring this up, all of that, to say land is scarce and so is Bitcoin. There's only ever going to be 21 million Bitcoin. And it doesn't matter if the government wants more Bitcoin. The only way they can get more Bitcoin is if they buy it. And that buying just going to mean that as more people want it, more people demand it, the price will go up, but the number of Bitcoins will not. And then if you start saying, government, you are only allowed to fund wars that you have enough Bitcoin in your coffer to fund them, now they're going to be a lot more careful about what wars they go to. If you say the only way that you're going to be able to do these social programs that you want to do is not if you print more money, but if you tax people and they have to give you their Bitcoin to fund these programs. Well, now if government starts doing programs they don't want, we're going to be way more focused on voting that person out of office. But as long as they have this secret tool, this one easy trick to be able to pay for whatever they want, they're just going to keep printing money. And as evidenced by when they took the governor off of how much money they can print, they no longer have this debt ceiling. They can do as much as they want. So they are literally printing trillions upon trillions of dollars. Inflation isn't going to stop. It's going to continue to get worse.
So this is a very naive question. Why are they printing money? Why are they printing money?
There's a very interesting YouTube video called Rules for Rulers, made by CGP Grey. That's a good starting point for thinking about why do governments need money and how do they use it. And at its core, the way that once you get power, one of the things about power is you have the purse to be able to say, I'm going to buy services from you. I'm going to pay you to do these things, whether that's police or building roads or all kinds of social programs. So if you have money, then you can pay people and they will give you what you want in exchange for that money. Now, if you have to tax people and they very directly see that in order to do that FEMA program that you're doing, or in order to build that bridge or that highway, we are going to have to tax you at this rate and then you're getting this in return for it, people will be very, very conscious of what is it that you're building. But when you can just print the money, then you don't have to go and ask the people. You just say, hey, we're going to do these projects and look how great it is. And it didn't affect you at all, because what you don't realize is what they're doing is they're pulling the future value of those dollars out of your bank account without you ever having voted on it. And since we've given them the permission to print money as much as they want, that's how they're funding these programs to stay in power.
Why have we given them permission to get to this point?
That's an interesting question. One thing I've learned from legacy interviews is that when people didn't have social media, they were very focused on the things that were around them. And they had time to go to PTA meetings and be on the board of county supervisors and participate in their church, not because there was more time or even that things were easier, right? They were hand washing their dishes. They didn't have dryers, right? So it was that now we're looking at our phones and we're worried about one election for a full year,
right,
where you get one fraction of a vote but it's easy to grab your attention on that. And the people that are in power benefit tremendously from being able to say, focus on this. It's Trump versus Harris, and just everything you should focus on. This is going to decide everything. And not only do we focus on that, but we've continued to give centralized power more and more control over things. So because they can print money, then they can say, hey, Missouri, we will come in and build your interstate as long as you give us control over these decisions. Now, Missouri wants an interstate because this is the way commerce is going to go through their state. It's going to make it so they can take grain trucks and more affordably get them to Mississippi and down the river. Like so they say, this trade, I'm going to make it in the short term because the government has the ability to do it, not realizing you're giving away all your power and people are focused on Washington, D.C. instead of what's going on in their local area.
I think 99.9% of all problems could be solved if people could project out into the future further. I think that is the biggest struggle that we have as human beings. Say
more about that. That doesn't automatically compute with me.
Well, if you simply looked, like if you're running a business and you're making decisions based on getting money in a year versus 30 years, well, now you're making decisions that will propel you to potentially becoming $1 billion business as opposed to becoming a short-term $5 million business. I mean, I would go even and down to the granular, right? You think about kids that are shooting each other up. I sound so old when I say that, shooting each other up. But these kids on these streets that I'm going to shoot this person right now. I don't care what happens 5 years from now. I could care less what happens from 5 years from now. I'm on my, if you're on your phone, if you're on TikTok and you're scrolling, and now my attention span is being shot to hell to where I can only focus for 3 seconds. How am I supposed to make any long-term decisions? Why don't I just leave it up to some other figure, like a false idol, to handle those big long-term decisions for me? And I think that is a lot of the reason why we're giving up a lot of power, because we're not projecting out into the future.
Yeah, and I'm called to mind the idea that attention is the most valuable thing that you own. And if you are spreading it out among so many things, it's very difficult for you to project about this thing and this thing and this thing and this thing and this thing. So we sit there and we're like, well, it feels good to predict, is it going to be Trump or Harris? When the reality is, like, you have a lot more things close to you to be paying attention to. One of the big insidious things that goes on with inflation is that as the government prints more money, you have to say, well, if I put money into the bank account, I just want to save it. I earn this money and I want to put it here so that I can use it in the future, right? You know that the value of that $1,000 that you put in there is going to be worth $800 next year. So you don't want to put it there. And in fact, I ask people this all the time. Do you teach your children to save in savings account? People are like, no, man. I tell them to put it in the stock market. Why? Well, because the stock market can potentially appreciate, right? So we have forced people to become investors in companies instead of just being able to say, I make money and I save it and I do the right thing and I don't risk it. And instead they say the only way to keep up is for me to guess, should I do this stock or that stock or that stock? And then you come along and you say, well, you're not going to be able to pick stocks because there are people that focus on this infinitely. So they're going to have the right stock picks and you're never going to get there. So what you should do is invest in this index fund. And now with index funds, every single Friday, they take money out of people's paychecks and put it into their 401k, and then they inject that money blindly into these index funds.
Who is they?
Well, whatever investment corporation your HR company put you with, they're saying, like, we're just going to take this money from your paycheck and we're going to invest it into the stock market. And the most efficient way for you to do this is to invest it in an index fund. You're not looking at one company. You're just investing in all of them. But all of these companies now become slaves to, how do you get in different index funds? How do you become in the sustainable index fund? Because when I was sitting down with my finance guy, I told him I care about the environment, so I want to be in the sustainability index fund that only has companies that have this score. And so now you are saying, I trust you to do these things. And now corporations, instead of focusing singularly on how am I going to make products that people need or products that make things better, now they're saying, we're going to do whatever it takes to get that score so that way we can be in that index fund. So every week we get this dose of money to keep making the stock market go up.
Who decides how they get into the index fund?
Well, it's like if BlackRock or Fidelity, they have their index funds, and an index fund is just a collection of stocks that they say, oh, collectively, this is the energy index fund. So maybe it's a whole bunch of gas and oil companies and coal companies. And then they have another fund that is just for commodities, or they have another fund that is companies that care about the environment. Well, those companies don't actually care about the environment. They care about making money, but they're going to make a sustainability report and focus on whatever metrics they can gather to give to the Fidelities and the BlackRocks of the world to say, please put us in your sustainability fund, because this person doesn't have enough time to tell whether these companies are really doing something good or not. They just want to know, my money is being invested into sustainable companies, and now you're just dumping money into those companies, not because they're producing great products or they're doing the right thing. It's because they're figuring out how to game the system. So this is further perpetuating this problem of companies that are out there that are not actually producing. They just figured out how to game the system, and they game the system because inflation is running so rampant that people don't have time to pay attention to this.
So this kind of newer incentive of inserting DEI into these companies, and so this is part of it, this diversity, equity, inclusion. A company like BlackRock is giving a score on things like this, right? Why wouldn't you have to imagine that these people are intelligent at the top and know, okay, a meritocracy is how we will produce the best products, make the best company. This is how we're going to have a well-oiled machine of a business. Why are they even inserting DEI in there? Are they following just what they see in culture, or this is very confusing to me.
Well, maybe let's take a step back and think about it in a different way. There's a man named Stuart Brand who runs an organization called the Long Now Foundation. So the Long Now Foundation, they took a look at the world and they said, you know what? Civilization didn't really exist until about 10,000 years ago. And that's when we discovered agriculture. And as soon as we can produce enough food to make it so we can survive, we're not constantly hunting, now we can produce pottery and roads and weapons and all of the things that make civilization. So once we discovered that 10,000 years ago, now look how far we've come. And the Long Now Foundation says, well, where will we be 10,000 years from now? Which is a fun exercise and kind of gets to what you were saying, how to think in the long term. Well, Stuart Brand has this concept, and it's worth people looking up, called pace layering. And pace layering is how quickly do different parts of our civilization move. So if you imagine like the Earth's core, that is nature. Nature changes very, very slower. You can think of like the Pangea, where we're all one continent and then they slowly move away, and we can't even conceptualize millions of years, but that's the speed with which nature works. Just above nature is culture. Culture is like, how do we understand what we're doing here? How do we interact with one another? How does language over time change? On top of culture is governance. So how are we deciding what the right thing to do is? What is justice? How are we organizing ourselves to outcompete our neighbors or cooperate with them? Above that is infrastructure.
And these are all getting faster as you go out, right?
Exactly. Good point. So as you go out in these circles, the change happens faster and faster. So you get to infrastructure. That's moving a lot faster than governance. So we're building roads, we're making airplanes, all these things are happening. Then on top of infrastructure, you have commerce. Commerce moves really fast, right? Because that's like, hey, what do people want? We're going to change as quickly as we can. So we're just going whipping around really fast. And then above commerce is fashion. And fashion is one of those weird things that it doesn't just go clockwork around there. It goes around and up and down and backwards, but it is moving super, super fast, trying to figure out only a few of those ideas on that outer layer are going to permeate into commerce, and even fewer of those are going to impact infrastructure, impact governance, impact culture, and maybe not impact nature. So when we look at companies, and you're talking about people's attention, where are they on that pace layering? I would suggest that because the money is losing its value so quickly, it has forced all of our companies to be at the fashion layer. And fashion is so brittle and so quickly changing that it is actually, if you look at it, it makes rational sense why they are doing these things, because they must make money now. They can't make money in 30 years, because if you had $1,000 in your bank account, what do you think that thing's going to buy you 30 years from now? Virtually nothing.
That is great. I haven't never heard you flesh it out that far as to why inflation is such a problem, but that is very poignant.
You're an excellent interviewer, and one of the big things, we talked about this before, is like body language. When I'm expressing an idea, I never have to think like, is this resonating? Is he getting this? Your body language tells me like, oh, keep going. This is great. Oh, it feels so good to tell Jack these things.
Well, great. I'm glad. I appreciate that. What do you think is what do you think the most recent thing in pace layering is to permeate, so that has gone from fashion to nature, or what do you think the next thing will be?
Bitcoin. I think that Bitcoin started all the way out. It wasn't fashionable, right? There's probably a better way to think of this, right? It's we talk sometimes about a concept called up the graph, right? Where there's very, very, very few people that know something, but the value of knowing it first is really valuable. And then as more and more people trade on that information, the value of knowing it early goes down. I think Bitcoin has not crossed the chasm into popular culture in the way that it will, but it is moving all the way into governance. So the country of El Salvador says, hey, this is national currency. The kingdom of Bhutan has said, we are building hydroelectric dams because we have all this energy that normally we just let the river fall from the mountains down. Well, now they're building hydroelectric dams to hook them up to Bitcoin miners so that they can mine Bitcoin. They've become the third largest holder of Bitcoin in the world.
Wow.
And one day that could make them one of the wealthiest countries in the world, despite the fact that they're just this little tiny kingdom. So we are watching that idea move down into infrastructure and governance. It's not permeated everywhere, but it will. There's no question in my mind. There's nothing that can stop this train other than thermonuclear war.
When that permeates to nature, what does that look like?
That's an excellent question. So a lot of people, when they talk about Bitcoin, they say, oh, look at the energy demand that has. Like they're just needlessly burning energy, right? And they're right that it requires electricity to run these miners. But these miners are doing something for us that's beautiful. They are creating security so that no one else can print this, right? They are creating like a real solid wall that even governments with battleships and fighter jets can't break through it, even with their giant NSA. So this is a value that you're getting from this. And it's also making it so you can transact. I can have a certain amount of Bitcoin. I can send it to you. I pay a small fee into that. Now, one of the greatest things about Bitcoin that people don't realize is Bitcoin miners are always in search of the cheapest energy out there. And so they are going to places like Alberta, where in Alberta they have oil and gas wells where you've got to burn off this natural gas because it's too expensive to bottle it. They won't allow them to put it in pipelines. And so right now they just flare it. They just light it on fire. You can see the flames if you drive around in Alberta at night. And so that was all just wasted. Well, now there are people that come along and they say, wait, instead of burning that, why don't we put a little generator and run that generator off of the natural gas that you're burning and then use the electricity from that generator to mine Bitcoin. And so now you are trapping energy that used to just fluff off into the air. The longer term consequence of this is places like Ethiopia that have trapped levels of energy can now, when before they would have to rely on the World Bank and these different groups to come in and say, hey, we're going to do a service project for you and maybe this will work. And I know I used to work at the World Bank. They would come in and say, all you got to do to get this loan is sign over your sovereignty. Well, now these countries can have a Bitcoin mining company come to their country and say, you have energy, we have Bitcoin miners. Let's work together to turn the energy that you have that's locked in the ground into electricity. And we will buy a bunch of that electricity to turn it into Bitcoin. But you're going to have extra energy that you can now start using to electrify your schools and your towns and your factories. And so now development is going to happen in these places where it used to be the energy was not worth it for somebody to go in and get it out of the ground and move it by a tanker to some industrialized part of the world where you're just exporting it. Now these countries are going to be able to develop, and we will see Africa develop in a way that 50 years of World Bank intervention bullshit never did.
Oh my gosh. Wow. What does that look like for the world? What is the Ethiopia that has an infrastructure that is capable of putting things out into the world and building themselves up look like?
The reason I compare Bitcoin to Gutenberg's printing press is that Gutenberg's printing press wasn't just that like, oh, now everybody can read the Bible. It actually made ideas possible to be viral beyond I speak words to you, which used to be the only way you could move an idea from one place to another was I actually encountered a person that was capable of containing that idea and spoke it to them, right? Once you have a book, now an idea can be written down and printed infinitely, and then these ideas can go out to people.
And it doesn't disperse along the way like the telephone game. You have that information.
Exactly. And now you can contain information, you can pass it on, it can be shared, it can be replicated. So now you took human capacity to take ideas and manifest them into things in the real world. Like, oh, if I understand how a pump works, now I can build a pump in my community and now we can have fresh water. Or I can understand how to build cement or how to have a baby without getting infection, right? This is the power of books. Well, now one of the things that Africa is going to get that it has not had in the past is electricity. So students used to go to school and they can read during the day, but if you don't have electricity, I don't know if you've ever tried to read by candlelight or by lantern, it's really expensive to read by lantern. You know, so you're sitting there holding your book trying to go off just a few lumens of light. Well, now you can actually sit underneath a light and read. So now you are going to unlock human potential on a scale that has never been unlocked in the history of civilization. And all those people living in Africa, they have all the capacity that Westerners have and people living in Asia have. And now you're going to turn on the lights and you're going to build factories and they're going to be able to say, we don't have to wait for somebody to come in and make us trade our sovereignty to build a factory here. Yeah. We're going to build it ourselves. And so what is going to come out of that? Who knows? But it will 1,000, 1,000,000, 1,000,000,000 flowers will bloom because of Bitcoin.
Wow. That is freaking incredible. That's amazing.
It's why I always say, like, even if you hate Bitcoin, right? You like have heard these things that have turned you against it. What I think is so fun about Bitcoin is every angle you look at it, there is beauty there. And there is beauty that I've discovered that I can communicate to you, but I listen to so many people talk about it where they're like, but did you also know that this will happen when we free ourselves from governments being able to print money or when you utilize energy in this way? And like every time you find a problem with Bitcoin, if you just say, yeah, I found that problem and it's dumb, I don't like it, you're missing the opportunity to say, well, if you found a real problem and you can solve that problem, then you bring all of us one step closer to sovereignty and freedom and making this world be realized. So anytime somebody dismisses it, I'm always inviting them to be like, hey, well, how would you solve that problem? What is the thing that you think we could do to overcome that? And the reality is most of the problems that are out there that people think of are already way solved. You just don't know it yet.
Is the government incentivized to stop Bitcoin from happening?
Nothing stops this train. I think governments should be incentivized to start mining as much as they possibly can. If you're a small country, your incentive is to find as many organizations that will come in and develop your energy infrastructure and start generating electricity as much as you can so you can mine Bitcoin for your own sovereignty. Right now, the IMF and the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. So this is the place where developing countries, if they want to stabilize their currency, if they want to trade on the world market, they have to do it through a relationship with the IMF and the World Bank. I used to work at the World Bank, and what you see is the people that are working there think that they're doing good, but really all they're doing is instituting Western bureaucracy and our fiscal control over them. So the World Bank and the IMF are going to places like El Salvador and being like, hey, we don't really want you to do this Bitcoin thing. It's too dangerous. We don't really like that. But El Salvador is now much stronger of a country, and other countries are going to look at this and say, we need to do this too. I think right now that's happening covertly. Our government, I think, is doing the opposite. They're selling Bitcoin that they have. They're like, oh, we have this pile of Bitcoin that we confiscated from bad people, and we're going to go to the market and just sell it.
Is that the case? Is that?
Well, remember when Silk Road got shut down? So
okay, so I'm unfamiliar with all of this.
So Silk Road is it was a you could call it a black market place for an economy. So where people could go online that was not readily available like eBay, and they could anonymously purchase things that you couldn't get. You could think of that as like negative things like, oh, these are illicit drugs. Or you could think of it like, my dad has cancer and I can't get the cancer drug that he needs, so I'm ordering it from Mexico and I'm having it shipped to me. So like, illegal maybe, yeah, okay. But the government came in, shut that down, and confiscated hundreds or thousands of Bitcoin, and they've had that held as in like an escrow account, and they have been fighting and fighting and fighting to be able to sell those. I don't know why on earth, if the government has them legally, I don't actually want them to have confiscated Bitcoin, but why they would do that, because that could be used as a national reserve. In fact, instead of having a gold reserve, we could have a Bitcoin reserve that says if the government wants to print more money, well, then what they have to do is they have to have the Bitcoin to back it up in their Fort Knox.
Do you think it's hubris? Do you think it's malintent? Like, why would they be doing that then?
Well, if you're the guy that has the money printer,
right,
you don't really want the people to have this power, because you want the ability to print money so that way you can hand that money out and you continue to secure power for yourself. But the other thing is, I've explained Bitcoin to all different kinds of people, and there's something so foundational and simple about it that it's hard for people to grasp. And so I have to imagine that there are a lot of people that are against it that are just like, I can't imagine it. And I use the example all the time of it is very, very difficult for me to imagine a project like in my yard being done. I know like, oh, these bushes, they need to be trimmed, but I can't picture in my mind what will the bushes look like after I trim them. So I just start trimming until it's done. And that's the way I work. And, you were talking about foresight earlier. I think most people think that, if they were to picture what will the world look like if Bitcoin is really instituted, it's not possible to imagine that future. And so instead of trying and trying and trying to do this, they just say, I like it the way it is. Let's just keep it how it's going, because I understand this system. It might not be benefiting me, but at least I'm comfortable here.
Well, I could go on for several more hours with you. And I feel like I'll know the answer to this based off of the last 30 minutes, but what is the most important thing that young people should be paying attention to?
My wife is the most important thing in my life, and it has been very, very difficult to understand this until after I've listened to hundreds of people tell their life stories. And by hearing other people tell their stories, and you hear how they're like, yeah, my wife, told me this thing and I didn't listen to her for 10 years. And then when I did, this other problem was solved. And I now see that with so many things in my life, that although I don't really like the way that my wife tells me how things should work, like when I really listen to her, things blossom. And so if I was a young person right now thinking about how do I connect with a high quality person that shares the same values that I have and is going to be able to go through the fires of hell with me, because that's what life is. Life is about the suffering and the difficulty and the challenges that are going to happen. So the person that you're going to spend the rest of your life with has to be somebody that you two are going to hold your hand as shit gets really bad, instead of turning at each other and being like, we're in hell because of you. No, we're in hell because of you. And so young people I wish I would have known this. I got lucky. I like stumbled into it. We've talked about this a bunch, but be thinking about that and get as far away from the gratuitous, I want to get the benefit of this person through sex or money or whatever they can get as far away from that as possible and find a person that you can walk through hell with.
Amazing. What did we forget to talk about that's important to you that should be said?
I mean, I was really hoping to turn the tables on you and ask you a bunch of questions like you did on my podcast, but I think you are truly an extraordinary interviewer, and you have a real deep gift for this.
Awesome. That's great to hear. Well, Jake's going to be upset because my ego is going to go up after that. He doesn't like it when I get an ego boost.
Yeah, that was a blast, dude. I never get to talk about Bitcoin like that. That was fun.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on.